Welcome to the Commentary Magazine Daily Podcast. Today is Wednesday, October 29th, 2025. I'm John Podhoretz, the editor of Commentary Magazine. And before we get going, I wanted to talk to you about the Hamilton School at the University of Florida. At a time when American higher education has lost its way, the Hamilton School at the University of Florida is setting a new standard, offering an elite education that's anything but elitist. Led by world-class scholars, Hamilton is reviving the classical liberal arts tradition, grounded in the great works of Western civilization and the founding principles of the American Republic. In small discussion-based classes, students study history, philosophy, economics, literature, and America's founding texts, developing the discipline, eloquence, and moral confidence to lead with purpose in their careers, their communities, and their lives. I was at a cocktail party the other night with people who have 12th graders who are beginning to apply for college or trying to decide where they might want to go to college. And I was telling them, if you're looking, you got to look at the University of Florida's Hamilton Scholars Program. You can learn more about it, not just from what I'm saying to you right now, at hamilton.ufl.edu/commentary. That's hamilton.ufl.edu/commentary. The Hamilton School at the University of Florida, leading a revolution in higher education. With me, as always, Executive Editor Abe Greenwald. Hi, Abe.
Hi, John.
Senior Editor Seth Mandel. Hi, Seth.
Hi, John.
And Washington commentary columnist Matthew Continetti. Hi, Matt.
Hi, John. And if I may comment on your excellent read for a moment, I've been making the rounds lately. I've been spending some time with some faculty at the Hamilton Center. I've been visited another university, Emory University. And what we're finding is there are so many great opportunities now to teach if you are neutral or center right, that I want to encourage people who are thinking about pursuing graduate study to do so. Because unlike, say, when I was in a similar position in college a generation ago, there are now career opportunities for people who think differently than the left-wing orthodoxy on campus. And so one problem those of us who are involved in campus reform face is a lack of supply. So I do ask people, think about graduate school at places like Florida or elsewhere, because eventually we're going to need teachers at great places like the Hamilton Center.
I have heard this as well. I've heard this from people who are helping to organize these places, who are helping to fund these places, that some of these places are looking for, in the next 5 years, as many as 50 or 60 different professors, and try to find 60 professors. I know this sounds crazy given the number of, there are 2,000, 3,000 universities in the United States, that finding 50, not only good, but finding 50 professors who do not subscribe to liberal orthodoxy is already difficult. So yes, suddenly it's a growth area. And as we're hearing from the panic over AI and youth in the United States, an interesting growth area, because people at the sort of higher ends or intellectual ends of young America are very much up in the air about what they're going to be able to do for a living for the rest of their lives. And this is sort of brings us back to a point in the 1950s and 1960s when academia was a growth area after the GI Bill and massive state investments, both state and federal investments in education. There was a point, I remember the father of a girlfriend of mine saying that when he got a PhD at the University of Chicago in the 1960s, he had 4 jobs to choose from when he was out on the job market, and he and his wife, with their small children, went touring to see what they thought was the best environment for kids, where their dollar could go further, all of that. Imagine that in a world of this kind of academic serfdom, that young graduate students who are getting out and maybe getting their PhDs are consigned to, where they make pretty close to the minimum wage. They often don't get health care, by the way, which is really hilarious given the politics of these campuses and these universities, and are sort of struggling in this bizarre, almost like, Raskolnikov in his garret writing articles for for radical publications, like they can't get themselves into the upper middle class or even the middle class exactly, given the way education is structured in the United States and the tenure system. So this is a very interesting thing over the next 10 years. And I'm glad you mentioned it, because it's a note of intellectual optimism for our side that, entering the right may not be, as it was, a questionable career decision if you were 21 or 22 years old in the United States, that you were limiting your choices rather than expanding your choices. So that is some pretty interesting stuff. Other interesting stuff that I'm going to have Matt monologize on here in a second is that the House Oversight Committee, I gather, under Jamie Comer, has released a very important report that I will confess, until he mentioned it 5 minutes ago, I did not know existed, which is important because it's part of the story.
That's right. You hadn't heard of the report because no mainstream outlet seems to be commenting on it. But that's exactly why we have places like the Washington Free Beacon, which has two excellent stories on the Comer report on Biden's auto pen presidency and pardons late in his term. What's important about this report is it's based on the testimony of Biden officials. You may have heard over the past few months, every so often, key members of Biden's team went to the House and testified under oath about the president's condition in the final year, at least, of his presidency. And what the findings are absolutely damning. I'm just going to read a little bit from Chuck Ross's piece in the Washington Free Beacon today, but it goes like this. A chorus of Joe Biden insiders who publicly defended the former president against concerns about his age and physical stamina sang a more sober tune in congressional testimonies. 14 Biden aides were interviewed. Many of the aides, of course, you all will recall, portrayed a public image of Biden as competent and in control of White House affairs, dismissing questions about his gaffes, ramblings, and faulty memory as offensive or gratuitous. Biden has this, in the phrase of Joe Scarborough at one point. He's totally in command. But in private testimony, Chuck Ross goes on, those aides admitted to internal concerns about Biden's cognitive decline and lethargy. Others declined to discuss the issue, dismissing questions or invoking their Fifth Amendment rights. But the testimony, as we go on, you see publicly Kevin O'Connor, Biden's doctor, publicly affirmed his fitness in multiple public statements, but in private, he invoked the Fifth Amendment when asked about Biden's physical health. And the Republicans have recommended that the District of Columbia Medical Board investigate O'Connor. And you know what? I think that's a good idea. Here's Jeff Zients, the chief of staff. He described Biden in early 2024 as a, quote, very energized president. And then he told Axios in August 2024, after Biden had dropped out of the race for re-election, that Biden would finish the job as strong as we started it and continue to make history. In private, Zients told the House that there were multiple discussions about how to reduce the number of steps Biden would take in public because they were worried about his physical capacity. And he admitted that Biden's ability to remember names also grew more difficult. Our favorite, Karine Jean-Pierre, who, of course, used the term cheap fakes to dismiss videos that showed Biden freezing up during speeches, was non-responsive to House investigators. Overall, the report, I'll just read from the language of the executive summary. It goes like this. As President Biden declined, his staff abused the auto pen and a lax chain of command policy to effect executive actions that lack any documentation of whether they were in fact authorized by the president. While President Biden became progressively less able to do his job when every measure should have been taken to document and, if ever questioned, prove that President Biden had made final decisions, White House staff took shortcuts and ad hoc actions to keep Biden afloat. The committee has found that there was, in fact, a cover-up of the president's cognitive decline and that there's no record demonstrating President Biden himself made all of the executive decisions that were attributed to him, in particular, those mass pardons, if you all remember, that came out at the end of his term. There's one other angle of the story which I think is worth noting. Among the Biden aides who testified was Mike Donilon, a longtime member of the so-called Politburo behind Biden. And there was an awkward moment, as Chuck Ross documents in another piece on the Washington Free Beacon today, when Donilon was confronted with the fact that if Biden had won re-election, he would have made $4 million in bonuses. And so it was, of course, in Donilon's interest and the other members of the Politburo in their financial interest to keep this idea that Biden was capable of serving as president alive for as much as possible. When asked about the $4 million, Donilon stammered for 45 seconds, according to the report, before stating his fee was a guarantee with the campaign. So what we have here is a picture of, one, the country being run not by the president, but by his closest aides who had been with him for decades. And it's not just that they're delegating responsibility from the president. It seems in the case of these pardons, they were actually designing the pardons and authorizing the pardons without the president's knowledge, which is a huge scandal. We were just reminded last week of the importance of the presidential pardon power when Trump has been pardoning people, including the crypto tycoon who has some financial interest with the Trump family just last week. So they're abusing this power, but you also see kind of the financial incentives Team Biden had to cover up his mental and physical condition. And then finally, as you say, as big as this story is, it's an even bigger story that it's not mentioned anywhere I can find other than in conservative media.
We have. I think there are 3 points that we should pursue here. One is this question of whether Biden was president in the last 6 months of his presidency in a fundamental sense. Was he making the decisions to move carrier groups? Talk about big decisions, right? Move carrier groups, how things were going between Russia and Ukraine and our role in them. And then, of course, the post-election questions involving the use of presidential power at the end of the term, which are often controversial, including the use of pardons, but also the drafting of executive orders that attempt to gum up the works for the next president by creating new facts on the ground the next president then has to reverse if they haven't been done by legislation. So when Biden announced that he was not running for re-election and that Kamala Harris should be the nominee, it wasn't just a talking point when people like us said, if he can't be the nominee, he should probably resign the presidency and let her be president. That is how our system works. She's the vice. If the president becomes infirm or cannot perform his duties, there is a backup politician elected by the American people who can take on that role. And if we understood that he was resigning on the basis that he had demonstrated cognitive incapacity to continue as a candidate, he had demonstrated cognitive incapacity to continue as president. And somehow that never rose higher than a kind of debating school argument that we would have and other podcasts would have and people would have. And I never quite understood why, but I think there's now a through line from what happened before he was shown up in the debate, 3 weeks of that bizarre backdoor campaign to get him to quit with George Clooney's op-ed and leaks from Obama, this, that, the other thing, and then onward, and why the press that supposedly loves a great story and loves, there's nothing more than like controversies of this sort that could really, because they were in on it from 22, 23 onward. We know that because we were talking about his cognitive incapacities for the 2 years before he finally acknowledged them with the retirement from the political campaign. But yeah, if you were Joe Scarborough, somebody was inviting you to the White House and you said, my God, he's 110% there. If you're Karine Jean-Pierre, who of course worked for him, she's like, boy, I can't keep up with him. He's so energetic and active. And where was Peter Baker? Peter Baker, noble, wondrous, young, now graying old man. But when I knew him, like the best young reporter in Washington back in the late 80s, 21 years old, a phenom, and writing books and being this remarkable presence as a figure of gravitas, but, importance. Like, he's the White House, the chief White House correspondent of the New York Times. He knew. I mean, if I knew, he knew. So why wasn't this a story then? Why isn't it a story now? Because it is a story about the complicity of the liberal establishment in the idea that, A, if you did do something about Biden, you might strengthen Trump, or B, your friend from Skull and Bones is the deputy chief of staff, and you see him every week at brunch, and he's going to be really mad at you. We don't know what the points were that created this conspiracy of silence.
I think Trump weighed heavily in the fact that this wasn't reported. But the other element that I think helped Biden remain in office after he withdrew from the race was Biden's insurance policy, and that was his vice president all along. Biden knew, the people around Biden knew, that trusting the presidency with Kamala Harris, even if it was for 6-7 months.
107 days, is that what you're saying?
Well, but remember, she would have been president until January 20th.
Okay. 167 days.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Would have been a disaster. So this is how cynical Biden and his crew were. That not only were they hiding the reality, but they had their backup plan, which was who would want Kamala Harris in charge. And let's not forget, it wasn't immediately that Biden endorsed Kamala Harris. It was that there was that gap of about an hour where things were a little up for grabs. Because again, that's a roll of the dice that the people who knew her best were not willing to take.
But something else occurs to me.
Sorry, go ahead. Sorry.
Something else occurs to me. It occurred to me, Matt, while you were reading the account in the Free Beacon. If you look back on incidents like, say, Lloyd Austin's disappearance, right? That's the kind of thing that happens, goes without consequences in an administration where the executive is already an absentee leader, right? So everything gets loosey-goosey all the way down the chain. I think you can look at Biden's condition and everyone's being in on it, and as a sort of framework for why, say, no one was ever fired either in that administration. Not just Austin, but for doing other things. Because the president himself was half there, and B, who might talk if they were then let go?
Well, that's always the case, right? You keep your friends close, your enemies closer, you keep the circle close, and if you don't have the mafia powers to, like take somebody out and leave the gun and take the cannoli, you better keep them, in the house so that they don't fire out. But the question here is the people who weren't officially in the house. The liberal establishment in the United States, as represented by the media, as represented by House Democrats, Senate Democrats, all kinds of politicians in the United States, they were there. They saw when he thanked dead people, when he started having conversations with dead congressmen he thought were in the front row, and stumbling on stage and falling down and having to take the back staircase off Air Force One because he could no longer be trusted to go down the front staircase. of Air
In,
Force
in
One.
20
I
in
mean,
2022, he had to go to bed instead of meet with the German chancellor, right, at a NATO gathering,
right.
and his Secretary of State took the meeting, and they were surprised to hear that Biden had just gone to bed. Now, when that happens, there's a traveling press corps, right? I mean,
Right.
those NATO
Right.
meets are big deals, and there's a lot of people around that notice that the president has not showed up to a one-on-one dinner meeting, early evening dinner meeting, with the leader of with his German counterpart or something like that. I mean, the number of people, and those stories came out later, but it was like at the time, you were also surprised that the European media didn't leak something, that people didn't say something. I mean, it was basically going on in front of the world. And then all these people in the Biden administration tried to convince us that they didn't see it. But it was
Right.
happening in front of everybody.
So that's strand number one. Strand number two involves the question of the applicability or the success in our constitutional terms of the 25th Amendment, which was passed in 1967. If you go and read the 25th Amendment, it's an incredibly complicated. There are two different processes outlined in the 25th Amendment, if I remember correctly. One is for the temporary suspension of the president's powers, and the other is for the permanent removal of the president. And it is, and you think, okay, this is very sane because, of course, the president is the only person who's elected by all the people. If his aides can just figure out some way to coup him out, then we are in a banana republic, or we're in some kind of like weird pre-revolutionary phase of the United States. So it's good that they created this thing where someone has to write a letter, and then a majority of the cabinet has to vote on it, and then then the president can almost at will announce in a letter that he's coming back, and then it's all done. Or at which point, if the cabinet who's close to him says he cannot reassume these duties, then I think it's 2/3 of the Senate and 2/3 of the House have to vote to agree to remove him. It's like the elaborate nature of it was intended to make sure that the presidency wasn't compromised by, Cassius and Brutus trying to figure out some method of getting Caesar out of the way. But we now have, I think, pretty explicit proof that the expectations that led to the passage of the 25th Amendment, what people would be willing to see, what they overlooked in the Wilson administration, and I think in part in the Kennedy administration, given the number of medications that Kennedy was on, 12 different medications a day to deal with his back, and he was clearly addicted to several of them in ways that might have had effects on his cognitive abilities. That's why this law got passed, or this constitutional amendment became part of our Constitution, and it didn't work. The one time that it really should have been invoked, it didn't work, and they had 2 years to invoke it. There are many reasons not to invoke it. You don't want to overturn the judgment of the people. Yeah, maybe you have a crazy person in the other party who will benefit, but that's supposed to be taken care of by the fact that if you quit, your vice president takes over. Your vice president is part of your administration. You have a continuity not only of power, but you have a continuity of sort of ideological direction, partisan direction. You're not saying we're going to early elections, right? There's no, which is what happens in other countries. And the fact is that the creation of the institution of the presidency militates against this very clear moment at which his refusal to acknowledge that he should not have run for a second term and what was going on with him did not cause half of his cabinet to say, in the interest of world peace, we got Russia at war in Ukraine, we got Israel basically at war with Iran, stuff is happening, he looks weak, who knows what tests we could be put to with him in charge and with him in office. But those people around him, not only did they not want to do that to him and they didn't want to help Trump, they also wanted to have the pardon power. Who knows how many of those people who were pardoned because they were, Jeff Zients' something or other. We don't know yet.
Let me just read from the report here. This is, again, from the report. Testimony before the committee confirmed that the pardon signed on January 19th, 2025, the day before Biden left office, which included pardons for members of President Biden's family, these are the preemptive pardons for his family, were apparently the result of an in-person meeting in the final hours of the presidency for which there is no contemporaneous documentation. Instead of actual documentation, the decision to grant these pardons was allegedly communicated secondhand to a Zients aide, Rosa Poe, who then called Zients, who verbally authorized the use of the auto pen from his home. Zients did not even know who actually used the auto pen to apply the signature after his aide, using his email account with his permission, communicated that the auto pen was authorized for the clemency actions. Zients did so without confirming with President Biden that he had in fact granted these pardons after repeatedly telling the American people he would not pardon his son Hunter, of course, who had been found guilty of crimes, let alone the 5 other members of the Biden family who are now preemptively pardoned in the waning hours of his presidency. So all this was going on without any direct evidence of Biden's involvement. Now we assume that Biden is behind it. It's his family, but it could also be some of the people who were, again, financially involved in the Biden family business over the course of many years. I think there's another point here as well, which is, so this isn't being covered in the mainstream media, but even if the media ignores this stuff, the public judgment on Biden and Harris is still very poor. And
the on Harris part is important, isn't it?
Yeah, well, we had just
thinking about what to do next.
We had this reminder just in the past week where Biden gave a speech accepting some Lifetime Achievement Award named after his old friend, the late Edward M. Kennedy. And Harris also gave the interview to the BBC where she left the door open to running for president in 2028. And it was almost like a Zen koan, the reaction to these two appearances. It was like, if a tree falls in a forest, does it make a sound? Because no one on the Democratic side was leaping up to say, oh, yes, what an incredible speech by former President Biden, how he's leading us into the future. And even with Harris's comments, I would say that while she still has some connection to parts of the party, it was not what you would call an enthusiastic reception. So even if the media tries to ignore what happened under Biden for 4 years, the after effect, I think, will continue for some time.
I had a third thing to ramp. So I brought up the media, I brought up the 25th Amendment, and now let's talk a little about the pardon power itself, because that is the regnant scandal here. Christine the other day said that she is a big advocate of doing something to reform the pardon power. We don't really know what the constitutionality is of reforming the pardon power by legislation, whether or not it would have to take the form of a constitutional amendment. But we now have two successive, with little ones before, two successive pardon power scandals. This question of whether or not the president actually pardoned anybody who is now officially pardoned because he did not sign the documents himself, and there's no direct, the president said use the auto pen because his arm hurts to do the pardon that he has now personally told you to take to the auto pen. The auto pen, of course, created in the 1980s because thousands of letters a year go out under the president's signature to donors and things like that, sort of like pro forma letters or thank you letters or things like that he doesn't write and that are written by members. There was actually an Office of White House Correspondence when I worked in the White House. And so, so he can't sign everything. Otherwise he would spend all day signing things. And obviously if you're going to do mass pardons, like you got this old man there, have you ever signed 1,500 different pieces of paper? Writers sometimes do this when they have a bestseller and they're going to sign 2,000 there's a hilarious John Updike story about his writer Beck having to go somewhere and sign 2,000 plates for a book.
It's so
that
nice to hear the name of Henry Beck, one of
Beck
my
was
favorite characters in all of literature.
Yeah. Anyway, but so this is obviously something that
There's a whole Seinfeld also where Jerry gets carpal tunnel syndrome from signing royalty checks that are like 13 cents a piece.
Right. Exactly. But in this case, it's like, thousands. It's like, as this Beck story is about, he's sent to just to not to go off on a crazy tangent, to make it more pleasant, his publisher sends him to like Anguilla or something like that, to a resort, so that he'll be in better circumstances and be able to go take a swim and stuff like that. But that the horror of this experience of having one after another of these plates are then, put in the books, pasted into the book so they can be sent out. It's a hilarious, portrait of sort of like the miseries of literary success, let's say. Anyway, so Biden, obviously, this is why you don't do 1,500 pardons on a single day, because like, you're going to have to sign them. No, okay, the AutoPen can sign them. And then suddenly it's like, you don't even have to have proof that the president said that the pardon was happening. So that's pardon scandal number one. There were prior pardon scandals, like when out of nowhere, Bill Clinton pardons Mark Rich, the fugitive financier, toward the tail end, on the last day of his presidency. By the way, casting a pretty dark shadow over the end of the Clinton presidency. This was no joke. Like, people talked about it for months. His reputation never quite, I know his weird reputation, but, he had sort of left in a weird place of good feeling because the economy had been in good shape and all of that. And then it was like, oh, you are the sleazebag that people were telling us you were during the Whitewater thing. And you're creepy. I'm just reminded how creepy you are. Did you do this as a favor to some woman? You did. His wife, Diane, his ex-wife, Diane, right? So there are prior pardon scandals. And now we have the Trump pardon scandals.
Can I add a corollary to the Biden scandal, though?
Yeah.
The preemptive pardons.
Right.
That is a constitutional novelty.
Second preemptive pardon, right? Who was the first preemptive pardon? Richard Nixon. Nixon was preemptively pardoned.
That's right.
By Gerald
Ford's
Ford.
pardon of Nixon was preemptive, right?
And he said, I am doing this for the health of the American polis. I'm pardoning the former president so that we can turn the page, leave this chapter of this American nightmare behind.
Long national nightmare.
And I am willing, essentially, he was saying, to suffer the assaults that I am going to get for the good of the country. And over time, I think people...
And he was right, and he did. Both of those things were true, right?
Exactly,
I mean, essentially, it turned out that it really was probably the right thing to do. To
almost certainly, because it would have been in court for 2 years.
Into that. And it's without question that he got punished for it. So
he certainly did get punished for it, but he did it because he was a patriot and because he was concerned about the future of the country and indeed moving on from this scandal. This is new. This is, I'm pardoning my son who did it. And to be fair, let's talk Tachlis here. Was he concerned that an incoming Trump administration would pursue his family? Yes. Were those concerns legitimate? Oh, yeah. I mean, Trump is pursuing John Bolton. Why wouldn't he pursue Jim Biden? I mean, Ashley Biden or Jill Biden or Naomi Biden. I mean, would he? Yeah. I mean, and if he wouldn't, there is some, Michigana there, at the housing department who would find out that somebody tried to take out a loan, while claiming it was their primary residence, and then try to secure an indictment on those grounds. So it's not like there wasn't logic to what he did, but was it a misuse of the pardon power? Of course, it was an insane misuse of the pardon power. So we now have two successive presidencies and you could even say the first Trump term where he was like playing those weird pardon games, fun pardoning. Oh, it's fun to pardon people. And here he is doing it again, right? He pardons George Santos for no particular reason, as far as we can tell. He pardons, he pardons the Binance guy, who, by the way, had already he'd served his time. He'd done his, he was over with. He had done his service or whatever. So I think there might be momentum toward pardon reform. Maybe it has to happen after Trump leaves office, because it will be seen, or it could happen if Democrats take the House and the Senate in 20, although he would veto it. But you now have enough obvious examples of what no continental member of the Continental Congress writing the Constitution could have conceived.
No, I
would
think
be used.
You need an amendment. I do think it has to be a constitutional solution, which makes, of course, very difficult.
Or less difficult than you think, because, of course, most modern constitutional amendments are on weird side issues.
Yeah. But also this would have
congressional pay increases and things like that.
And this would have bipartisan support.
That's what I'm saying.
Which is crucial because
right.
Both
and
parties.
as with the amendment, when Truman was in office about running for a third term, you could just make it not apply to the guy sitting in the office right now. Like you could take care of the Trump problem by making it clear that it doesn't limit his ability to pardon.
Right. Which, of
course,
course,
like it didn't apply.
Yeah.
But why do we think it would go in the direction of reform rather than this is now the start of a new way of doing things?
If we don't reform it,
sure,
then the president is established in two directions. One, the president can have fun with the pardon power, which is horrifying. And two, the president can preemptively pardon anybody he wants to keep them silent or to keep them out of jail. When he asks them to do bad things, he'll be like, no, I'm asking you to do bad things. Don't worry, I'll pardon you.
My amendment would be very simple, and that is the presidential pardons are effective unless the Congress vetoes them with the 2/3 vote. Very high bar.
That's a very high bar.
But I think that's kind of in line with our constitutional language. And that would be, I think, acceptable to both parties. But anything closer in this age is not going to get anywhere.
I mean, whatever the language is, you can see how there are various things that have to happen for a constitutional amendment to pass. But, weird constitutional amendments have passed in the last 20, 25 years that have been sitting, one of them sitting around since for 200 years almost, got its 38th state, and then was a constitutional about how congressional pay is, how you have to vote in two successive.
Right.
I mean, it's weird. It's like it's the least important thing you could possibly imagine. But my point is that we now have the pardon power misused on all sides in successive administrations in ways that are discomforting, I think, to both parties, including the behavior of the president of their own party. I mean, I don't think many people in the Senate or the House are thrilled that he pardoned the Binance guy or that he pardoned George Santos. That's like, now, wait a minute. Come on now. Like, who wanted George Santos?
Well, we had this interesting action in the Senate just yesterday on the Brazil tariffs, where GOP voters joined with the Democrats, 52-48, to end the tariffs on Brazil, which, unlikely to pass the House. But you see on this issue, the trade issue was always the issue where the Senate was different from Trump, and where a lot of Republicans, in their heart of hearts, aren't really fully invested in the trade war. In fact, it's hard to find someone outside the White House complex that is fully invested in the trade war, other than Robert Lighthizer, who spends his time between the D.C. area and Florida. So this would be an example. This would be a potential place where you might see some congressmen say, well, it's not just the interests of the country that require reform of the pardon power. It's not just to our partisan advantage to have some limit on the power of the presidents of the other party, but it is also to the interest of our chamber, of our branch, to put a limit on the executive. And in my fantasy land, where I'm living in as I speak right now, that would be enough to get this 28th Amendment passed.
We also, by the way, have the case of the Senate intervening, probably actually at the behest of somebody without the White House's real objection, in the nomination of the mayor of Hamtramck, Michigan, to be our ambassador to Qatar, who is a kind of semi-Islamist. For some reason, he got the nod. Yeah. And the Senate is clearly either he's going to have to withdraw the nomination, or the Senate is going to.
Well, look, the Senate. There's some other examples. Paul Ingrassia, the nominee for the Office of Special Counsel, after Politico unearthed these text messages about Martin Luther King and Nazis, his nomination was withdrawn. E.J. Antoni,
right,
my favorite economist, you know him from the Heritage Foundation and Fox Business Channel. He was nominated. I was supporting his nomination to head the Bureau of Labor Statistics, but he just didn't get off the ground. They withdrew that nomination.
You're talking about getting off the ground stuff. So the question is, if the administration were to insist that the mayor of Hamtramck, Michigan, got his vote to be ambassador of Qatar, it would still go down.
Right,
is my guess.
Yeah, well, I mean, getting off the ground is usually communicated. The Senator Thune tells the White House Office of Legislative Affairs, "There's no votes for this person."
Yeah, although there have been cases where people say, "No, let him have a vote. We want to record. If you're going to go against us, we want people to know it. You vote him down, and then we'll express our outrage."
Most famous case was Robert Bork, who insisted himself on a vote, even though he knew and the White House knew that he wouldn't be confirmed as a Supreme Court justice, much to America's loss.
Very much so. So here we have, given who took his place, obviously. It is so ordered. Anthony, it is so ordered Kennedy. Eventually. Of course, the joke there was the guy who was initially nominated to replace him, Doug Ginsburg had to withdraw because he smoked pot once.
Well, I love this total diversion. But in researching my piece on the Free Press this week about Reagan and trade, I was reading Reagan's diary, which, it's among my more unusual habits, but I do turn to it. And I came across an entry in 1987, around the time he made this speech, and also around the time he met Trump, where Reagan recorded a phone call from a cabinet member urging him to drop the nomination of Douglas Ginsburg after it was revealed that the Supreme Court nominee had admitted to marijuana consumption. And the call from the cabinet member came from Dr. William J. Bennett. And I just love that Reagan said, Bill Bennett called me urging, drop Ginsburg. And said it was a blast from the past. I loved it.
That's why Bill got appointed drug czar a year and a half later, and I was there. That was one of my two jobs in government, was helping to set up the drug czar's office. And let me tell you, you don't want me in government because I was not very good at it.
Should we talk about the ceasefire?
We should talk about the ceasefire. So we should talk about the language of the ceasefire, because Hamas is obliged, in order to conclude phase one of the 275,000 point peace plan, to return the bodies of the hostages that they still have, and Hamas is not doing so. So Hamas is in violation of the terms of the plan, which included in phase one the ceasefire, in which Israel would ceasefire, would pull back to give autonomy or non-Israeli presence to 43% of Gaza and hold their fire. And Hamas has been violating the ceasefire since it stopped delivering the bodies, and because they are running rearguard actions and they're firing on Israeli troops and soldiers.
They're killing Israeli troops.
They're killing Jews. Yesterday, they're killing Jews. And from some reports that we're hearing, all of which are anecdotal, the soldiers there say that things are hotter actually for them than they were before the ceasefire, when the advance on Gaza City had the Israelis on the move and the Hamas on the back foot running away. So they weren't exactly engaging. Like, this was really a kind of rout. And so obviously when you're on the routing side of a rout, you're much safer than you are if you're standing still and someone can like come up behind you and, you know, shoot you in the back. So Israel,
by the way, that was a fear of people who were against
of course
this plan to begin with. It was that very situation was what was
right. There were two fears. One, like long term, right, which was, we're back in it again. We're releasing hundreds, if not thousands, of Palestinians from Israeli jails. This is how this all started. It's like the eternal return. You know, almost 1,100 people released in 2011 when Gilad Shalit was released from custody, one of them being Yahya Sinwar. You know, 12 years later, Yahya Sinwar is leading October 7th. Who's the Yahya Sinwar in the pile that just got, you know, released, right? That's the long-term one. And the short-term one was, if you say we can't fire our guns, they're going to know we can't fire our guns, and they're going to, now, obviously, you're allowed to fire if you know someone is firing on you. But if they ambush you, if they come up, climb up your back, then you're in trouble. The language would be that Israel, in Bibi Netanyahu yesterday calling on and launching pretty serious strikes against Hamas for this game that they played yesterday, where they returned a body that was actually partial remains of a previously returned body. So they were holding on to partial.
I think not even previously returned. I believe the IDF discovered the remains themselves.
They were recovered
and brought them back.
The body.
I don't think it wasn't. It wasn't. Hamas hadn't returned
partial,
even.
Yeah, and
part
then we
of
have
it.
the video
of
Hamas burying
right,
the remaining remains, and then uncovering them as part of this cynical ploy.
Can we just quickly explain, under Jewish law, like, there is this, if you're going to pursue this policy that you must get the dead bodies back under Jewish religious law, and it's quite astonishing what happens here. If you are going to bury the remains in that way, you must have as complete a version of the body as you can in the coffin when you bury it. There are these Israeli, they're called Chevra Kadisha, but they're also, which is the group that watches a body before it goes into the ground. But there are these forces inside Israel when there is a terrorist bombing or something like that, who, and this is going to sound gruesome, so excuse me, who will literally go around scraping bricks to make sure that they find blood, you know, like tiny pieces of tissue, so that a version, as complete a version of the body can be in before interment. And this is viewed as the fulfillment of the mandate that the dead must be buried. And so and Hamas knows this, and so it's a particular act of desecration to withhold pieces of a dead body. Like,
and Ophir Tsarfati, who is the victim in this case, we should note that this is the third time the family had to bury him, which is to say his remains were discovered by the IDF in 2023. They brought them home and they had a ceremony and buried what they had. In 2024, more were discovered. And so you had to dig up the grave and add them to the grave. And that was a second one. And the fact that Hamas has knowingly been hanging on to other parts of his remains, these weren't just discovered. Hamas was just holding on to these for fun and to torture the family. Now means the family has had his third burial of their child. Right.
And so you have that story, which is a story of, you know, the joy taken in the torture. And then you also have, as I say, there's
the Red Cross laughing on, by the way, also in the video.
Yeah, that's right. And you have the desecration quality, which is that this is important to Jews because it is a religious ritual for Jews, and you are spitting on that. So it's a great foundation for a lasting
And
comedy.
a soldier was killed as well.
Yes, and a soldier was
An
killed,
IDF
and
soldier.
several
Three
I think-
IDF soldiers have been killed since the beginning
Right.
of this ceasefire. But
Right.
apparently, according to the intelligentsia, the ceasefire is binding only on Israel. The way they just, as I understand it, as a Neanderthal caveman pundit, a ceasefire binds both parties in a conflict, which would suggest that if one side violates a ceasefire by not obeying the language of the ceasefire, by delivering the 13 remaining bodies that are supposed to be part of the phase 1 hostage release, and by taking up arms to kill soldiers in the other side of the conflict, that gives the opposing side the right to enforce the ceasefire, but
right.
not apparently according to the international human rights community and media, which is reporting all of this. The flashpoint last week, and then what happened yesterday, as Israel puts ceasefire at risk.
Right.
Yeah.
Or
testing
Israel.
It's the equivalent of Republicans' pounce.
It is. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
okay. So what's important also to note, I think, and in terms of the use of vocabulary, and I don't know whether they invented this or whether they took it from somebody else, but I want to commend Josh Kraushaar and our friends at Jewish Insider, because the verb that they used to describe what Bibi was doing, or the Netanyahu and the Israeli government were doing yesterday, by ordering strikes on Hamas positions in response to this game that was A, the killing of the Israeli soldier, and B, the game with the remains, was maintaining the ceasefire. Israel is working to maintain the ceasefire.
That's exactly right.
Which I think is a really, really good verb, because that is what they are. That is, in fact, what they're trying to do is say, Hamas, quit it, and now give us the bodies and stop firing, quit it, live up to the terms. And and they have to enforce it if they're, if the international coalition, which is actually not supposed to be monitoring this part of the phase, by the way, nothing in the first part, nothing in phase 1 says we need, the forces of the international forces that are going to maintain the ceasefire to play a role yet. They're being assembled as we go. And then this is referred to either as Israel's risking or Israel's breaking the ceasefire.
And the person who understands what is actually happening is the President of the United States, who on the other side of the planet, on his way to Korea, was asked about what happened yesterday by reporters. And he said, Israel's responding to Hamas's violation. And look, Hamas can either cooperate or not. And if not, then Hamas is going to be destroyed. Trump is rock solid on this. And it's worthy of commendation.
It is so worthy of commendation, because every person who is not skeptical, let's say, of the ceasefire, but worried in the way that we've been talking about here about what the ceasefire might portend. Did it mean that Hamas is not finished off? Is it an acknowledgement that Hamas can't actually be finished off? So you're going to do as much as you can. All of that stuff. Will the Israeli government fall because the Smotrich and Ben Gvir, the far right element, are saying that he's not living up to his efforts to extirpate and destroy Hamas? All of that stuff. We are now faced with Israel having to live within the terms and worrying about the United States falling in love with its own deal. And this was part of the fear, is the United States is going to say, don't do X, Y, and Z because it's going to make our deal look bad, and we love our deal. No one loves this deal more than we love our deal. and don't make us look bad, which is what kind of previous administrations have always said. It's like, don't do X. We like this. If Trump is the one who says Israel can go ahead and do this, it means that the sort of Witkoff, anything for a deal crew, if they were in this position, is checkmated. Because the big guy has already said they're free to do what they have to do to enforce that deal. But you can make a fetish of the piece of paper, and it's not surprising that Trump doesn't make a fetish out of a piece of paper. Everything, if you're a transactional person, the ink is not dry on this piece of paper, number one, and there's always a waiting period or a period where you can pull it back. But yeah, it was absolutely necessary, even though we know the top figures, right? Or the top figure, if the top figure were Rubio is exactly where Trump is. We don't know where Vance is. We don't know where other people
Trump
are.
is the president.
Yeah, he is the president.
For 3 more years.
They've been trying to, the narrative here has been one of Israel needs to be restrained, right? Not just, will it happen? And so yesterday, the Washington Post published this long story about apparent Israeli nervousness. Now, I'm sure that there is a level of discomfort in the Israeli military echelon about the degree to which they might be restrained. That's always going to be the case, because if there are American troops there now, which that is unprecedented, rare, whatever you want to call it, that is, that American troops being even in the vicinity is the sort of thing that stops everybody in their tracks. But at the same time, you have to build the case that there is a need for restraint. You have to cherry pick the facts and leave out Trump's own statements, right? So, for example, they say in the piece, here's what they say. When Hamas so they have a paragraph saying Israelis are anxious that Trump will give Hamas a pass. And it says, when Hamas reasserted control in Gaza earlier this month by attacking rival clans, some of which acknowledge they are backed by Israel, Trump initially said the fighting didn't bother me much. Well, okay, but then what did he say? Because then he said, if Hamas doesn't stop attacking, we're going to have to go in and kill them, right? I mean, that was this. Yeah. This is the cherry picking that I'm talking about, right? So, Trump says, quote, "We will have no choice but to go in and kill them," end quote. That quote is not included in the Washington Post story. It ends after "didn't bother me much." Yeah. Then it says, when Hamas said it needed more time to find and return the bodies of deceased Israeli hostages, Trump said that they were under rubble and pointed out that Israel had killed 70,000 people, contradicting Israeli assertions that Hamas was deliberately withholding many of the corpses. But then what did he say? Then he said, they better return the bodies, and they have 48 hours, and they're only going to be treated fairly if they comply with their obligations. And if they don't, then the other countries involved in this great peace, all caps, will take action, he warned. And Hamas that night, after Trump's statement, returned 3 bodies. So you have to construct a narrative leaving out the most recent and the most relevant information in order to portray this as it is. And I think that reveals a frustration with the media world and the activist world, that Trump really is, the guy with the finger in the dam sort of thing here, that he calls the shots, and he's the one thing standing in the way they're used to being able to pressure an American president and all that stuff. And he's,
very interesting aspect of this, then we can go to your recommendation, is that media are caught in a trap, which is the 2 figures in the democratic world that they loathe the most, the liberal establishment media, are Donald John Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu. And there was this glowing moment 2.5 weeks. And by the way, this is true in Israel as well, where in Israel they hate, Netanyahu more than, they've ever hated anybody who has ever lived. So there was this glowing moment when you could turn to Trump having helped create a ceasefire, and say, Trump, he made Bibi do it, and he forced him, he took him, he yelled at him, and he scolded him, he told him not to do that thing in Doha, they took it away from him, Bibi's angry, Trump is pushing, yay, Trump, crushing Bibi's hopes and dreams and wishes, right? Now, Bibi's like, okay, I guess I'm going to have to go fire on Hamas. I don't want to. Trump's like, no, you do it. You go in there. So they got nowhere to turn. Either they can use Trump to beat Bibi as a stick over, to beat Bibi over the head with a stick, or Bibi, if they turn on Trump, then they got Bibi. So they got nowhere to turn. They hate both major players here, and then you get left to one side the genuine supervillain of the last 2 years. Not even a supervillain, just a villain, because I don't think it's a supervillain. But like the Gutteries, the Al-Thani family, like they're the real bad guys here. Aside from obviously Iran, but Iran really did get its pretty heavily. But it's still this like Bibi versus Trump thing, whereas Trump essentially turned to the Gutteries and maybe the Turks and said, you get Hamas to do what we want. Like, enough already. You get Hamas to do what we want. And either Qatar is playing footsie with Trump and sort of winking at what Hamas is doing, or it's showing that it doesn't have the power and authority that it wanted to project over being able to control Hamas's actions at least a couple weeks ago. That in fact Hamas is an independent actor, or it's like basically let loose and will do whatever it wants to do. The fact that there is still a body of opinion that isn't saying, wait, you mean this is all about holding dead bodies instead of returning them to their family? That's the one sticking point to keep us from going to phase 2. But of course, Hamas doesn't want to go to phase 2. Hamas wants anything but to go to phase 2, because what is phase 2? Disarming Hamas. So of course they're gonna do whatever they can to delay phase 2, or to make it so that phase 1 is the only phase of this conflict. Okay, Seth, you have a recommendation?
Yeah, I have one of the more remarkable, I guess you'd call it a Cold War books, a Cold War spy-ish novel or something that I've read recently. But the book is called The Feeling of Iron, and it's by the Italian writer Jamie Alonge. I'm sure I'm mispronouncing some part of that, and I apologize. But it's quite remarkable. It is essentially it goes back and forth between two periods. One is there's a Mengele sort of figure during the Holocaust, during World War II, a German who was doing experiments with drugs on behalf of the Nazis, and he's running and he's doing these experiments on Jewish prisoners, etc. The other period of time is 40 years later, and the German had been born in America, had been recruited by the CIA after the war. He had escaped, and he had come, and he was doing experiments for the CIA, running against the Contras, and two of his former two of the Jews who survived his testing lab. One worked for a sort of Mossad-ish revenge organization within Israel that the Israeli government didn't really love, but whatever. And the other one worked for the KGB. And the two Jews converge, both getting information about where this Nazi is, this old Nazi in Latin America, in Honduras, and they are chasing him to get their revenge from 40 years ago. And all three of these characters are working for and living in different countries than they were when they originally all came together. It's
Whoa,
not
that
quite as
sounds-
complicated as it sounds.
Sounds
But
great.
it is.
So-
It's really something's called The Feeling of Iron.
And the author's name again? How do you spell it?
So it's Giaime, the Italian version of Jamie,
Yeah.
whatever, and Allonge, which is Alonge.
Okay, very quickly, because you put me in mind of this as you were talking. One of the best movies of the last 10 years that I really because it's about also sort of pre and post Nazi regime. The third movie made by the writer director of the best movie of the 21st century, The Lives of Others, Florian von Donnersmarck, in 2018 made a movie called Never Look Away, which is about an artist or the life of a young artist, beginning with his childhood in 1938. Begins with the Degenerate Art Show in Berlin in 1938, and then flashes forward to the 1950s when he is an East German, having ended up in East Berlin, and going to school under communism, having grown up under Nazism. And the images, the art images that start coming into his head from his childhood, which he has largely forgotten. And it is a story about living under different forms of totalitarianism, what it's like to be an artist when art is being suppressed in favor of political realities, and how dormant secrets can emerge out of nowhere. It is a stunning movie. You can rent it on Amazon and Apple like for $3-4. I'm generally not a fan of this genre. I'm not a fan of the pre-post, sort of. I find that stuff often too schematic, but at any moment I can recommend this movie to people, which was nominated for an Oscar, for best foreign film, didn't win, but really is a masterpiece, and it's called Never Look Away. And your novel is the title again, because I'm old.
A Feeling of Iron.
The Feeling of Iron. Okay. The Feeling of Iron, Never Look Away. We'll be back tomorrow for Abe, Matt, and Seth. I'm John Podhoretz. Keep the candle burning.